Hi there, in this video we're going to take a closer look at sanders and sanding, so if you're at all confused about which sander you should be using when and what for, well, join me after the jingle when we take a closer look at what's on offer. It's coming up next. Now I've got an awful lot of sanders, too many to be honest, and the reason for that is quite simple. I keep buying them. When my work arrives, it tends to come and go in phases, and I tend to gear up for whatever particular type of job it is, and often I just don't bother getting rid of the sanders afterwards because you never know when they might come in handy. This means that I've got all kinds of different types of sanders, though in truth I don't actually need them. I'd say 95% of my work is done with just two types of sander. Stay with me and I'll let you in on the secret of what those two types of sander are at the end of the video. My first experience with power sanders, as they were called back then, was with a Black & Decker power sander, 1960s model that belonged to my dad. And my dad actually gave this to me when I left home and when I first started doing bits and pieces around my home. In truth, it was a fairly gruesome piece of kit made in that sort of turquoise plastic that Black & Decker used to use. No variable speed, no pad changes, just a single piece of sandpaper that sort of clipped around the base with those spring clips. Dust collection, that hadn't been invented yet. And yet, if you have no power sander, then any power sander is a good thing. That particular type of sander was what they call an oscillating sander. If you imagine that's the sanding pad and a pin going through it, it basically just sort of waved around that central pivot point like that. Now, fairly obviously, if that's a sander, the top and bottom of that pad are going to be moving a lot further than the middle. So as sanders go, that wasn't particularly useful, not particularly good. And these days, pretty much the only oscillating sander that you can buy now, as far as I'm aware, are these. This is a little detail sander, and fairly obviously, because you're typically only using the very corners, that oscillating motion not only doesn't do it any harm, but is actually quite useful because you're almost always bearing down on the points of this triangular pad. I've got a little painted board here, and I'm going to run this sander very gently, just moving very, very gently so that it doesn't sort of dig in, to give you an idea of what that sanding pattern actually looks like. So there we are, that's our sanding pattern from the oscillating sander. Fairly obviously there's a central part there which is not getting much action. Now you would have to move that sander around an awful lot to make sure that was covered. And obviously on a detail sander like this, you're really, as I said earlier, you're really only using the very points of the triangle. So oscillating sanders as a technology didn't hang around for that long. They were largely replaced by orbital sanders, and as the name suggests, the sanding pad actually made a circular motion, so it spread the sanding power much more evenly across that pad. In fact, now the majority of entry-level sanders you can buy are orbital sanders. Orbital sanders are typically rectangular in shape like this one. This is sometimes called a palm sander. Sometimes they're square. Often they're a little bit bigger than this in 1/3 or 1/2 sheet sizes, but the basic principle is the same. And again, we're going to run this on this painted board just now to give you an idea of the sanding pattern that creates. So there we are, that's our orbital sander. You can see at the very ends where you're not getting as much pressure on because I wasn't moving it up and down or around particularly aggressively, but you can see it has a much more even sanding area across the pad like that. Now, a lot of orbital sanders are still extremely useful, especially for smaller lightweight tasks or for sanding edges and that kind of thing. But if you do try and use them on a flat surface, what will happen is that because they have a regular circular orbit, when you move that orbit around, you find that you're generating a very predictable kind of pig's tail scratch pattern, and that isn't always what you want. So the next bit of technology that came along to try and solve that was something called a random orbital. Now, random orbital sanders are almost always circular. This one is a finishing sander. You might recognize this one from the sanding veneers video. This is a short stroke, so a 2mm stroke. And what random orbital sanders do, as well as having a circular motion, they allow the sanding head to sort of jitter around a little bit, so it's not in a predictable way. In fact, if you put enough pressure on a random orbital sander, you can stop it still. So very important that you don't put too much pressure on an RO sander. And again, we're just going to run this one on our painted test piece, and we'll take a look to see what sort of scratch pattern we get. So with this one, we've got the small stroke random orbit. You can actually see around the edge of the paint where it's sanding away, you get a very gentle, very sort of gently feathered part to it because it is such a short stroke. But again, because you're not moving it very much, you do get this sort of dead bit in the center. So you do need to move the sander around in order to reduce that. Now the next sander we're going to look at is also a random orbital, but it's a 6-incher, 150mm, and this has a more aggressive stroke, a 5mm stroke. And again, all the same things apply. It's a little bit bigger and heavier than a finishing sander like this one, but it's a good general purpose sander, and we'll run that on that painted piece now. So again, with this one, you can see there's this sort of dead patch in the center, but it's a much more clearly defined edge to where it's sanded and painted. So it's much more aggressive on that particular spot. 5mm stroke in this, so you don't see too much of the sort of pigtails around the center here. But again, you do get sort of a dead spot in the center. You do need to be moving these sanders around. Now, random orbital sanders have become very useful general purpose sanders. They've largely replaced the half sheet orbital sanders that we used to get. They were always really good for finishing large flat areas, whereas a random orbital, certainly a 6-inch 150mm like this with a wide stroke, has largely replaced that. And again, dust collection is a major consideration now, and the vast majority of sanders that you can buy today will have decent dust collection, decent dust extraction built into the sander itself. Moving on from the random orbital sander, we've got a slightly oddball one, a slightly specialist one. This is the Festool Rotex, or gear-driven sander. There are other gear-driven sanders from other manufacturers. I think Makita and Bosch both do them, and Triton as well. This is very similar in many ways to a random orbital sander. In fact, it will have a genuine random mode as well, but it will also have a gear-driven mode. And the difference is, oops, in a regular random orbital mode like this, the pad is pretty loose. In gear-driven mode, you actually really need to apply a bit of pressure to turn that. So that's being driven, so it's much more aggressive. And again, I'm going to give this a quick shot on our painted workpiece now. So I didn't manage to get this particularly even, but you can see how much more aggressive it is even than the 5mm stroke on the random orbital. This is a much more clearly defined line here. You can actually see where I've lifted off the back of the pressure, the back of the pad. You can actually see the scratch marks of that abrasive cutting through. All these abrasives are the same, by the way. They're all P80, and all the sanders are set to broadly the same speed. So it's a pretty close comparison, and you can see how much more aggressive that Rotex, that gear-driven sander is, and the center spot has almost disappeared. So next up would be a belt sander. I rarely use these, to be perfectly honest. Even when I was doing other kind of work, there was almost always a better solution for me. I have this little one because, as you may have seen recently, it's quite handy for doing little scribes and things. You can't get this anymore, unfortunately. It's a little Dewalt one-handed belt sander with a 2.5-inch or 65mm wide belt. Belt sanders are really designed for taking off large quantities of stock quickly, and I almost never need to do that, or if I need to do that, there are other ways of doing it. There are many kinds of reasons why you might want a belt sander, but none of them really have much appeal for the kind of work that I do. So this is the only one that I have, and to be honest, it rarely gets used. I probably used it more for sanding the corners off dominoes than for anything else. As I say, I used this quite successfully in the recent scribing video, so it did come in handy for that. But as always, there are other ways to do that. This is absolutely not designed to go onto a flat board, but I will do it anyway, just to give you an idea of the sort of a horrible mess you could make of a flat board if you did use a belt sander on it. So there we are, that's our belt sander. I can actually feel a ridge there where it's dug in. It is very aggressive, even for a little thing like this. And as I said, absolutely not the thing to use on a flat board like that. It's for shaping edges and for getting into slightly trickier areas. As I said, I used it with some success with the scribing videos when I needed to put a back bevel on a piece of board like that. Okay, moving on to a slightly oddball sander. This is called a linear sander. Literally, the pad just moves back and forth, and it's supposed to mimic hand sanding. It's sold as particularly for painters and decorators, where if, for example, you've got a whole house worth of handrail of one particular type to sand, what you can do is they make like a solid urethane foam pad. You could put a piece of abrasive over the handrail, use the foam pad against it to take the shape, and then you can stick your abrasive to that, and then you've got something that's the perfect shape for the handrail. You would have to have an awful lot of handrail to make that worthwhile, I think. The reason I bought this was that at the time I was doing a lot of sash window refurbishments, and there's a particular point on a sash window box. Certainly when I was doing this, they would be really crusty and full of paint. It's hard to get off with a chisel without damaging the woodwork, and this sander was a good way of getting into that space, and because it just moved up and down, it didn't try and joggle you sideways. As I said, very much a bit of an oddball specialty, and we'll just run that on our painted board now just to give you an idea of what that would do. So yes, very linear, as they say, literally straight up and down, no ifs or buts. It's a little bit uneven because of the way the pressure I was using. Again, I don't think I've used that sander for 5 or 6 years. I probably ought to get rid of it, to be honest. And now I've done a video about it, I might just do that. But yes, it's an interesting thing to have, but not something I would use very often. And finally, we're going to go to almost back to where we started, another slightly oddball one. I mentioned earlier on that pretty much the only oscillating sanders that you can get now are detail sanders. Well, Festool, of course, have gone a slightly different route on that. And their detail sander, which I used to have, and I don't have anymore. It's one that I sold when I bought this small Rotex, and I kind of regret selling it now because it was actually much smaller than this, which meant you can get it into a much smaller space. But with the triangular pad, the detail pad on this Rotex, you actually get an orbital sander, not an oscillating sander. So if you do need a detail sander where you need a particularly even spread of sanding power across the whole pad, one of these or one of the old Deltex, Festool Deltex sanders is definitely the way to go. I'll show you what I mean on this board now. So there we are, that's the difference between an oscillating sander and a detail sander at the top and an orbital sander, detail sander at the bottom. Much more even sort of wear, much more even sanding across the whole pad. So with all these sanders available to you, where do you even start? Well, I mentioned earlier on that I'd tell you about 2 sanders that I'd recommend. And you start here, you start with a 6-inch 150mm random orbital sander. One of these in your repertoire will cover an awful lot of the sanding that an awful lot of people want to do. This is a 5mm stroke, which is a particularly sweet spot. Combine that with a fairly high speed and an aggressive grit of abrasive, and you can strip paint with this very easily. Change that down to a slower speed and a finer grit abrasive, and this is almost a finishing sander. The range of work that this can do is simply extraordinary. If you can afford it, I'd recommend getting one of these as well. This is a little palm sander, an orbital sander, fantastic for finishing edges. It's lightweight, so it's really good for sanding walls or ceilings. Just a great all-round sander. These two together will cover, I would say, 95% of the sanding needs of 95% of you guys watching, to be perfectly honest. They probably cover 95% of my sanding needs as well, and I do this for a living. It makes you wonder why I've got so many sanders, and I probably do need to have a bit of a clear out. That's it for this week, though. I hope you found this whistle-stop tour around my sander collection useful, and I hope it's helped clear up any uncertainties you might have had about the most appropriate sander for your sanding needs. Don't forget to check out the video description down below, where you'll find links to all the fine products you've seen here today, as well as links to all kinds of other handy little bits and pieces that I hope you'll find useful in the workshop. And by using those links, remember you support the channel at no expense to yourself. I'd like to take a second just to thank my Patreon supporters, without whom I've been making these videos in the dark. Their regular contributions really do help me to keep the lights on here, and Patreon supporters also have access to a weekly workshop vlog and behind the scenes videos, as well as some bonus content made specially just for them. And there are links down in the description below where you can join Patreon and support the channel. If you've enjoyed the video, then do consider subscribing. It takes 2 seconds and it costs you nothing. And if you do subscribe, don't forget to hit that bell, then you'll be notified whenever I put up something new. But that's it for this week. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.